All right, and I I will just briefly. I want to introduce Allyson Olson from the Nebraska Department of Education, and she is how would you call the director?
Title III Director, ELPA 21 Coordinator.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, and so she's here to share this particular class involves ESL assessment, but I also sent out to all of my ESL people. I got another bunch of graduates, and I even included my multicultural ed because I may get some ESL students out of there. So I will go ahead and let you go, and this is all on recording, so I will preserve this for eternity. So
All right. Well, and you're certainly welcome to use it however you see fit.
thank you.
So for those of you that are able to join us live today, first of all, thank you very much. I know that whether you're a student or a teacher in the classroom, I know you have a busy schedule, and it's really nice to have the chance to connect with you live. I do have a few slides. I put that together mainly to help organize my thoughts and present some things that I thought might be relevant, but I'm going to go pretty slow and really frequently ask if there are any questions. I'd much rather have a discussion than just sit here and talk to a computer screen. So don't hesitate if you're wondering about something. Gustavo, I appreciate your comments a little bit about the ELPA 21, and I'll be happy to share what I know about the background of that test and some of why it is the way it is. So Glenn, if it's okay with you, can I do a screen share then?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
We'll do this. Okay.
All righty.
Should work now.
Let me try this one.
Yep.
Okay. Oops. All right. Can you see the slide that says English learners and assessments? Awesome.
Yep.
That's right where I want to be. Okay. So I wanted to talk just really briefly initially about how we identify English learners, and it starts with a home language survey. So every district should have, as part of its registration packet, a home language survey. And there are districts that have electronic packets, there are districts that use paper, either one's fine. I've highlighted the 3 questions that are required by the federal government to be on a home language survey. So you can see there's some basic demographic stuff here, that's fine, but also some questions about what language did your child first learn to speak, what language is spoken most often by your child, and what language is primarily used in the student's home, regardless of the language spoken by the student. And when this form is completed by the parent, if there's an answer to any of these questions that's a language other than English, that's an indication that we should screen that student, provide a screener. And so in Nebraska, we do provide, the Nebraska Department of Ed purchases the ELPA 21 dynamic screener and makes that available for districts to use. Districts do not have to use that screener, and there are some that choose to use a different one. The most common reason I hear for that is it does take a few days to get the scores back. It screens students in all 4 domains: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. We do have a commitment from the test vendor that for students in grades 6 through 12, we get the scores back within 48 hours, because a lot of times we're waiting for that information to make placement decisions. Which courses do they need to be in? And obviously we want students in school, in classes, as quickly as we can get them there. If a district chooses to use another screener, as long as it's valid and reliable and assesses all 4 language domains, they can do that. I personally think there are some advantages to districts using the ELPA 21 screener. It uses the same platform as the ELPA 21 assessment, and so both the students and the test administrators get a little bit of experience. They get to be familiar with the test system and the platform that's used. Just a couple of exceptions to that rule based on the home language survey. If you're in a Nebraska school district and you have a student move in from another Nebraska district and they've already been identified in Nebraska as an English learner, there's no need to screen. We know that student is an English learner and we go ahead and start providing services. So Nebraska is part of an ELPA 21 consortium. There are 8 states, and I have them listed here, that also participate. And so students are taking the same test. Sometimes it's labeled a little bit differently. I think maybe Arkansas, Louisiana call it something a little bit different, but it is the exact same ELPA test. And so if we have a student move into Nebraska from one of these states and they bring an ELPA score with them, or we get it through school records, then we can accept that as well, whether they've already been identified or if they've possibly exited. Now, the most common one, obviously, because Iowa is a border state, especially on the eastern side of Nebraska, we do see a lot of movement between students going back and forth, whether it's Council Bluffs and Omaha, or Sioux City, Iowa, South Sioux City, Nebraska. And so most commonly, if we're going to have students move in from another ELPA state, it would be Iowa, but it does happen that students would come from one of the other states. So it's probably most helpful to think of that home language survey as the first wide net that we're casting as we try to identify English learners. It's not perfect. There are times where parents maybe make a mistake in filling it out. Parents may not understand why those questions are being asked. Sometimes a student might come into the school and teachers are fairly convinced this is an English learner, but the home language survey doesn't reflect it. The other thing that happens fairly commonly is parents might answer more than one language. And so you might see English, English, and then on the last line, it might say English/Spanish. And we really do need to know, is the answer English or Spanish? Because in that instance, it's going to make a big difference how we move forward. So if we have doubt or uncertainty about the information on the home language survey, it is acceptable to reach out, call the family, and just ask for clarification. Ideally, we can use an interpreter to make that call so the parent can have their questions answered and understand why they're being asked the information. And then I just advise districts to just note right on the form itself, or if you have an electronic record, talk to the parent by phone on this date, this is the correct information. So there's a lot that rides on that form, but it's not perfect. It's still a form, and so mistakes can be made. So that's basically how we start with identification. Any questions or anything coming to mind about that?
No. And you get the results in 48 hours for the certain groups, right?
Secondary students grades 6 through 12.
Okay.
Right. The test vendor says for those students that would be kindergarten through 5th grade, it could take up to 7 days. I've never seen it take more than 4 or 5 days, but sometimes it does feel like a long time. And again, I believe that districts that choose to not use this particular screener because of that delay, they have a valid point, and I understand that. It's an online assessment, and the speaking component especially and the writing are scored off-site, and that's why it takes a little bit longer.
Okay.
So one of the things that's not at all uncommon to see, experienced EL teachers can usually tell while they're administering the screener whether or not the student is going to qualify. And when those scores come back, it's really just a validation of what they thought probably was going to happen. Okay. So once we have some students identified that need to be administered a screener to determine their EL qualification, every district really should have a plan in place. In Nebraska, we have a number of what we call low incidence districts. They just don't have very many English learners, maybe anywhere from 1 to 10. We have districts in Nebraska who have never had English learners, but every district should include the home language survey. Otherwise, they really don't have a systematic way of identifying English learners. It's also highly recommended that every district have a plan in place what would happen if tomorrow a student comes in and is potentially an English learner and we need to administer a screener? Who's going to be responsible for doing that? How are we going to get that person or those people trained? There's quite a bit of support that I can provide through the Nebraska Department of Ed. I have a colleague who also works with me, and we have 6 Title III consortia around the state where the consortia directors support smaller districts really, really well too. So it's not like there's no support out there, but districts do need to understand their responsibilities and to have a plan in place as to how they're going to meet them.
Okay.
So one of the requirements under ESEA, the Educational Secondary and Educational Act, which dates back to 1965, the most recent update and iteration is ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that is that the parent needs to be notified of the child's English learner status 30 days from the start of the fall term. And if the student is not present when school starts in the fall, then the window is 2 weeks. And the reason it's longer at the beginning of the school year is because typically there are more students that need to be screened. Sometimes, you know, as I mentioned, it might take a few days to get the screener results back. So there is a little bit of leeway at the start of the school year. But if a student moves in today, October 7th, and we get that paperwork and we give the screener, we've got 2 weeks to get the student identified and to notify the parent. Questions over identification?
No, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, I kind of like that. I like that it's cut and dried. It's pretty black and white. Okay, so now once a district has some English learners, they are required to have a language instruction educational program. Now in Nebraska, we really do allow a lot of leeway about what that program might look like. And as you can imagine, there's huge variability among the districts in Nebraska. We've got some very, very small ones. We've got some very large ones, different amount of resources. What's common is that the language instruction educational programs need to provide a systematic approach to teaching English. It does have to be based in theory and effective in practice. And a huge shift that came about between No Child Left Behind and ESSA is that in addition to helping our English learners increase their English proficiency, we also have to ensure that they can access grade level content. And so it is, when you think about grade level standards, especially at the secondary level, think about math and science and ELA and all of the skills that students need to be able to do. Our English learners have to acquire English at a rate and in a way that allows them to access that content as well. And it has to be available so that all students can access the programs and activities, and that's including English learners who may qualify for special ed. I'm going to talk about there. When we talk about whether it's effective in practice, there is a requirement that Nebraska districts conduct an annual EL program review. So at least once a year, districts should be looking at their ELPA 21 scores. They should be looking at their N scores, any classroom assessments to see how are our English learners progressing. One of the data collection pieces that the Nebraska Department of Education collects, because we then have to turn around and report to the federal government, when you have an EL program, what does that program look like? And there are 7 options here. In Nebraska, we see very commonly option 1 and option 3. If you think about a push-in program where English learners are served primarily in a content class, that's program option 1. If they're pull out, maybe a dedicated section of English learners, ideally with an ESL teacher, that would be a program option 3. For districts that have dual language, that's 2, that's listed there. There are some districts that have heritage language programs. Typically we see that at the high school level, where the students in that class may have some knowledge. A lot of times they don't read and write in their native language. The instructor is typically fluent there. And then the other options, and you can have more than one. It's not uncommon for districts to have maybe a partial day newcomer program where students who have recently arrived receive pretty strong supports, and then maybe they're in regular ESL classes the rest of the day. Typically that newcomer program is going to be for a designated period of time, or until a student reaches a certain level of proficiency. We don't really want them languishing there. And transitional bilingual or early exit bilingual education, where students start very young. Mostly instruction is in their first language, and they're transitioning to their second language, which is typically English. So there is an other option I would just like to mention. We don't consider sink or swim to be a valid EL program. So even in the smallest districts with the most limited resources, that's where I and my colleague, the Title III consortia directors, will work with you to structure your EL program. We'll work with whatever resources you have, but not having one or just putting kids into classes and hoping they succeed is never going to be an acceptable option.
How common is that when people try to just squeeze by with nothing?
Well, if they're doing that, they really try to make sure I don't find out about it, because I'll call them out on it. More commonly, what we'll see is we see under-resourced districts. I'm aware of a couple that want to really rely on paraprofessionals for instruction. Paraprofessionals provide tremendous supports to a good EL program. Their role is different than that of a teacher. And the law in Nebraska that governs English learners is Rule 15, and it does specifically state that the EL program has to be overseen by a certificated educator. And so we really do need someone who's a teacher or administrator. Ideally, they've got some background or knowledge of English learners, but, and the para can certainly support the teacher's lesson plans. Frequently paraprofessionals might go into a classroom and help the ELs with content classes. That's perfectly acceptable, but it's really under the supervision and in cooperation with a certificated educator. So other questions, comments on any language instructional programs that you might be wondering?
I noticed we got Michiko and Katie and Bailey have joined us.
Hi, glad you're here.
And so we just had, wherever you came in, we've been introduced by Allyson to the ELPA, and also screening for English learners. I want to encourage, if any of you, if you have any questions, you can freely jump in here. I'm recording this, so any good questions are welcome. Any questions are welcome. So I guess I'm getting the silent treatment here. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. So are you going? Where are we at in the presentation?
I think we're probably about the halfway point. Maybe I was going to talk about specifically about assessments a little bit more.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Okay. So every state is required to have an annual English language proficiency assessment. And in Nebraska, as I mentioned, we are part of the ELPA 21 consortium. And ELPA 21 stands for, as you can see, English Language Proficiency Assessment for the 21st century. Technically, there are two assessments that fall under that umbrella. There's the ELPA 21 Dynamic Screener. That is available pretty much year-round. It does go offline for a few weeks in the summer for sort of retooling before the new school year. And then the ELPA 21 Summative. And the Summative has a defined window. It's a 6-week window that happens in the spring, early spring. This year, February 8th through March 19th. The expectation is that every English learner in Nebraska who's in grades K through 12 will participate in the summative assessment. English learners with disabilities are also expected to test, and that presents some challenges. I'll mention really quickly. So the ELPA 21 was developed from the Nebraska ELP standards. Those standards are aligned to the college and career ready practices. So earlier when I mentioned that in addition to helping students increase their English proficiency, we also are required to ensure that they can access grade level content. And I do on a fairly regular basis get some feedback and some concern shared that the ELPA 21 is a difficult test. The screener is a difficult assessment. In Nebraska, at the kindergarten level for the last 2 years, 98% of the students who have been screened end up qualifying. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, I think we have to accept and acknowledge that there is no perfect assessment. There's always a margin of error in an assessment. And if we're going to make a mistake, the prevailing thought is, and it's one I agree with, it is better to over-identify and to provide supports for English learners than to potentially misidentifying students who are English learners. We don't want to miss them, because if they are identified as an English learner and they have high levels of proficiency and they're doing well in their classes, districts can scaffold the support that they have. So those students don't need to be in an ESL class. Frequently, they're not even in it for a part of the day. The ELPA 21 is non-adaptive at this time, and so that is something to keep in mind. If you're scheduling it and you're going to give your students a listening, or I'm going to say reading assessment, if you've got two students sitting there sharing a table taking the reading assessment, they are seeing the same questions. And so it's just something to keep in mind as we're scheduling and spacing students out and things like that, that this particular assessment is non-adaptive. Students get the same questions in the same order if they're working within the same grade band. There are 4 separate subtests with the summative. So listening, reading, writing, and speaking are all scheduled separately. Depending on the grade level, the K through 3 are pretty quick, 15 or 20 minutes a piece. By the time we get to high school, it can be 45 minutes or longer for each one of those. Reading and writing sometimes take a little bit longer. And so there's a fair amount of instructional time that is dedicated to assessing students on the ELPA 21. So I mentioned accommodations. Well, I wanted to talk about accommodations because even English learners with disabilities who might have an IEP or a 504 are expected to take the ELPA 21. I will mention that there is an alternate ELPA 21 that's in development. The state of Iowa received a grant from the federal government, I think is about $8 million. We're in year 2 of that project. Should be finished by about 2023. But if you think of the students with them who are the most severely cognitively impaired that typically would take an alternate NSCAS, right now there isn't an alternate ELPA for them, but it is coming and it's anticipated to be available in the year 2023. So they're working on it. Until then, so we look at just providing accommodations for students. And this chart comes directly from the ELPA 21 accommodations manual, and it's really divided into different levels. So the universal features, any student can have them. It's an untimed test. There are some features within the system that could allow students to, they can flag for review, they can highlight, they can zoom in if they want to see larger text. Scratch paper is considered a non-embedded universal feature. It has nothing to do with the test system, but anybody can have it. Then there are some designated features that can be turned on if they're identified in advance, those within the system. We could change the color contrast. There are students with some visual issues that maybe need to see it differently than black text on a white screen. They can answer masking. We could limit the number of choices. Non-embedded, they can use color overlays, different things like that. There are some students who do better with the paper and pencil test. Not too many anymore. We don't get too many requests, but it is allowed. The student might want to read the test aloud to themselves. That is allowed if they're obviously in a separate testing room. And then for students who have an IEP or a 504, if they need unlimited re-recordings or unlimited replay of the speaking and listening portions, they can have those. There is a Braille version. There's a large print booklet. Students may need a scribe if someone has motor impairment, or it could be something as simple as a broken arm, something that maybe is temporary, but during the testing window, the student may need a scribe. And so it is really important just to think about the accommodations that students need throughout the school year. They shouldn't just occur on a summative assessment, but just know that they are available. The other approach that we have is we can allow domain exemptions. And so if you think of the 4 domains, on the summative, at the state level, I can approve a domain exemption, and we really only approve those if a student can't access a domain. Sometimes we'll get a request that says, you know, I'm concerned the student isn't going to do well on this. That's not a good enough reason to exempt a domain. The best example I could give you, a student who is deaf literally cannot access the listening domain. And so we would exempt that domain. It's also not uncommon. Sometimes we'll exempt the speaking domain for students who have hearing impairments because those two tend to go hand in hand. The other common request that we approve for exemption requests, there are some students who are in, they've been adjudicated, they're in a facility, and a lot of the facilities in Nebraska don't allow technology if a student has gotten in trouble or something going on with them. And so the speaking can only be accessed through the online system. And so if the student is unable to use a computer because of some rules of the facility they're in, there are once in a while some students who maybe have some cultural limitations that they don't allow technology. And so we can request that, and we can use a paper pencil test for those students. But when we do that, we have to exempt the speaking portion. So I did include the link to the accessibility and accommodations manual if anybody wanted more specific information. It's pretty helpful to read through it and see, especially if you're in the classroom and you might be wondering what your students are entitled to. I'm just going to stop there for a minute. Any questions over the accommodations? I really talked specifically about ELPA 21 so far.
Allison, I do have a question about the ELPA assessment in general. So with just with the pandemic in my district, majority of students are face-to-face instruction, but we do have some students that have qualified for online learning because they have a medical diagnosis or significant health concerns. So they are currently not in school. They're doing an online program. And so far they have been given the approval for online learning through the first semester. And then I think our district is going to re-examine things before second semester. But I'm just wondering if those, I have 2 students that are EL students that are doing online learning. So I'm just wondering if they're still online come ELPA summative, how do we test them?
Love that question. Love that question. Thank you for asking it. So here's what I can tell you, and this information is new as of, I want to say, what's today? Wednesday, probably Monday. So really recent information. A year ago, the test vendor for ELPA 21, which formerly was AIR, they were purchased by an assessment company called Cambium. And Cambium is a huge nationwide assessment provider. And they actually provide state assessments for a number of states. Nebraska partners with NWEA for its NSCAS, but Cambium does this for other states. They do have processes in place to allow for online learning. Now, what we haven't done so far is we haven't administered the ELPA 21 online. And so I think we're really close. I think we're probably a week or 2 away from the point at which we're going to be looking for a couple of Nebraska districts who might like to pilot, the two tests that are available online right now are the ELPA 21 screener and a practice test. And the nice thing about the screener being a part of the pilot, typically when testing companies are piloting tests and they ask districts if they would participate in the pilot, the only real benefit to the district is we get to learn a little bit about the test. Most of the benefits go to the testing company because they're literally taking this test for a test drive. In this particular instance, it will be the actual ELPA 21 screener. So if you have a family that moves in and based on the home language survey, you need to administer a screener, there would be an option to do that screening online. And that would allow those pilot districts to test drive the system. How would this work? And it's going to give some feedback to Cambium about their online assessments. And so, yeah, I'm kind of with you, Katie. You know, I think last March, I would never have predicted that here we would be in October, still with the need for online assessments. I feel like it would be naive and irresponsible to not get some plans in place for an online administration of the ELPA 21 summative, while at the same time, I'm keeping my fingers crossed and I hope we don't need those. So does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And kind of a further question on that. So one of these students did take the paper pencil assessment last year. So what recommendation would you give for this student when it comes to the summative assessment if he is still an online learner at home?
Right. I'm not sure that I have a really good answer for you right now, and it has to do with test security. ELPA 21 is a fairly new assessment. We don't have thousands and thousands of items in an item bank. And so if, for example, I just say, and this wouldn't be my decision, but if I just speculate and say, oh, we'll just mail you that paper test and you can send it to the student's home and have the student take it there. We've just lost the security for all of the items on that particular test. So that's for that grade span for that test. And so I don't know yet if there will be a paper pencil option for the remote administration. I just don't know yet. We're working with the vendor to get this information, and I share it as quickly as I can. I've got an email distribution list with about 250 people in Nebraska. So I'd be happy to add you to it if you want information as I get it. I'm going to add just another piece to this conversation. So today, the Nebraska Department of Education assessment team held a fall workshop, and every year they just hold these fall workshops about upcoming testing seasons. And the NSCAS test is undergoing some changes, and the result of that is the test that's going to be administered this year is really a new assessment. They're moving to a different model. And with this new assessment, we're going to lose the ability to look back over historical information. We're not going to be able to compare last year's or 2 years ago to this year. And so because of that, they have decided that there's no accountability. So the Nebraska Department of Ed Assessment Office is offering, they will make available COVID waivers that if a district has families who are unwilling to bring their children in to be tested, they would just fill out this waiver. And I believe the waiver has to be filled out at the district level. And I understand the rationale. We really don't want to encourage parents to start opting their kids out of assessments. It's always an option, but it's a very infrequently used option. And so that's coming. Here's where ELPA 21 is different. So again, back to ESEA, going all the way back to 1965, and it's been updated now with ESSA. It explicitly states that every state education agency will ensure that the districts in their state test every K-12 English learner on the annual ELP assessment. Where NSCAS has like a 95% participation threshold, there's always a little wiggle room there. ELPA doesn't have that because the only way a student can test out of English language services is to test proficient on the ELPA 21. And if we deny a student the opportunity to take that test, we are potentially violating that child's civil rights. We're also into some Title VI territory, and it just gets really complicated. A year ago, Education Secretary DeVos very quickly granted waivers for all 50 states that requested assessment waivers. And so because of the pandemic and because of everything that was happening last spring, all accountability, all assessments, everybody got a free pass last year. There's already been a memo that she has sent out this year saying, don't expect that this year. So my view is, I'm always going to advocate for our English learners. I can't exceed my authority and tell districts you don't have to test your ELs. I'm going to encourage and expect that all of our English learners in Nebraska do participate in the ELPA 21. If we have families that, especially, Katie, especially if we get this online option that's available, because that could accommodate the concerns about coming into school buildings and whatever. So it's pretty early in the game. Again, I want to be laying the groundwork for whatever needs to happen when the window opens, but I just don't have all those answers today. So hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm curious, do you guys agree with me? I mean, when you think about that statement that says every K-12 English learner will participate in the annual ELP assessment, do you see an option to not test our students? Yeah.
Hi, my name is, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not really sure, I'm not really familiar with this screening test because I'm not in the field right now. And then first of all, I was wondering if you have any sample test so that I can take a look at it, because the contents, like detail of the exam is like, I'm just curious what they look like. And secondly, you were just wondering if all the students, EL learners, need to have this test. But to me, I think all the teacher knows that, even like before you take a test, you know exactly where your students are. I think the teacher can tell much better than have them take tests. I would say it's not a bad thing. However, I don't think it's very necessarily, because it's, again, if you're a teacher, you can tell
right.
where your students are.
Right. I absolutely agree 100%. And to be honest, I think there's tremendous value in those informal formative assessments that happen every day in the classroom. And when the teacher is right there, the teacher's adjusting instruction based on the information they're getting. So tests like the ELPA 21 are very much connected to accountability. There is actually another piece in Title III that states that every state must have standardized entrance and exit procedures. And that's part of why, and I also have heard the concerns, and I actually agree with it. It's not very good practice to make placement decisions based on one data point. And yet, because we're required to have standardized statewide entrance and exit procedures, that's why that is written in there. It is to be compliant with the federal law that requires us to do it, because we couldn't have any kind of standardized procedures if we've got teachers in 249 districts across Nebraska, all even interpreting rubrics the same way. They're always somewhat subjective. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's just things, and I guess, I've been involved with assessment for a long time, going back in Nebraska from STARS to NISA to NSCAS. There are some components of assessment that I don't personally like. It's sort of one of those things that it's part of the job and I accept that I have to do it. But I absolutely agree with you that teachers know more about where their students are at. And we try to align the tests to the standards. I know that you're teaching to the standards. Gustavo, to your point, I'm going to tell you, I know that there's some additional alignment that needs to be done so that the results that we're seeing from the test would be in line with your expectations of what your students can do. I think it's unusual to hear that you've got students with very limited schooling who are scoring very well on the ELPA 21. It makes me wonder, are they guessing? I mean, although the productive domains, writing and speaking, you know, it goes beyond a multiple choice.
Allison, to answer the question that you had about should all K-12 EL students be assessed annually, I really appreciate that an alternative assessment is being
We need it.
made. I've had several EL students that are also curriculum life skills students, and the format of the assessment right now just doesn't give us even a good indication at all of their language proficiency. Is that an assessment that will be piloted?
Most likely it will be.
Okay.
I've been involved from the start with the development, and what I can tell you is that it's really a, I'm so impressed with the process and with the team at ELPA 21 that is working on this. I mean, the psychometricians and the science behind it, we started by really examining sound assessment practices and then even going into defining what is speech. Again, we're talking about that 1% or less of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Many of them use adaptive technology. And so how are we defining speech? How are we defining writing? There's a lot that's going into it. The summative assessment will be developed first, but then there will be an alternate screener available as well. So, and until then, continue to request domain exemptions. And the other thing I'm just going to mention briefly, it is allowable in Nebraska if we have a student who has an IEP who is also an English learner, that we can make a team decision. If the team determines that language is not the child's primary disability, that team can make a decision to exit the student from EL services. One of the things that I like to see happen is we should have some history of assessments. For example, if we see students with maybe 2-3 years in a row, they've not scored beyond the emerging level on the ELPA 21 summative, that's an important consideration for that team to consider. Are the students' needs being met by the special ed case manager? If that's the case, why would we put that student through an ELPA 21 every year? And so you do have the option of doing that. Now, I push back a little bit. Sometimes if it's a kindergarten student, unless they're, again, most significantly cognitively disabled. But if it's a resource student and they're kindergarten or first grade, that student really hasn't had sufficient time. When we think about the length of time to learn a language, we haven't given that student enough time before we just say it's not a language issue. It's a really, really complex, just to discern between language and disability, there isn't an easy answer. There's a lot of information that needs to be evaluated. We need to gather input from a lot of different individuals, including the family. And so it's never an easy decision to make, but we certainly can make that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
With reclassification, sorry, this will be my last question. And
I love the question. You're good.
So with reclassification, and this question has come up often in our districts, but when a student reaches proficiency on the ELPA summative, then we monitor them for 4 years. Is that the same with reclassification? Do we still monitor for 4 years?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. And just so you know, that monitoring is also happening on the students. If they're still in grades where they're taking the NSCAS, basically those redesignated English learners are sort of flagged in the NDE advisor system. And so we're monitoring their performance on the NSCAS as well. But that should just be part of your annual program review where, you know, you're just really looking at how your students are doing. And very seldom do we get requests or questions about moving a student back into EL services after they've exited. You know, my question to a district asking that is always, is it necessary for a student to carry this label in order to get support? Because we should be able to support our students, whether we call them English learners or special ed students or whatever. So sometimes the student needs a little bit more time or whatever, but if we see a district that is frequently trying to put students back into EL after they've been exited, we probably want to take a pretty good look at those exit decisions and make sure that they've been well informed. Okay, any more questions on ELPA? Those are really good questions. You guys are making me think at the end of the day. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about the NSCAS assessment because our English learners also take these assessments. Grades 3 through 8 take English language arts and math, and then grades 5 and 8 take those two tests in addition to science. And there are universal features available to all students on these assessments as well. Scratch paper, some students do better in an alternate setting. We could reread the directions. Specific to English learners, there's a text-to-speech in English option for math and science, everything but the reading passages. There is a Spanish online form. There's a word-to-word bilingual dictionary that can be used. As I'm sitting here telling you this, I'm thinking about the assessment workshop we had today, and I do need to correct this. This year, because of the pilot, or because of the new test that they're implementing with NSCAS, there are not any paper, pencil, or bilingual assessments. So if we have a student who would typically need a Spanish test, that's not going to be available and the student would be exempt this year. But I also included the link to the accommodations manual for NSCAS if you have any more particular questions. And again, that information is just starting to come out from the Nebraska Department of Ed Assessment Office, so I know there will be more. ACT, and this is huge, about 2 years ago was the first time that English learners are allowed accommodations on the ACT. ACT is frequently the first timed test that many of our students take. NSCAS is untimed, NWEA's MAP assessment is untimed, ELPA is untimed. And for our English learners, having extended time, they can have up to time and a half. There are some translated directions that can be used, and there is an approved list of word-to-word bilingual dictionaries that English learners are allowed to use on the ACT. If you have high school English learners, even ninth graders, I strongly recommend getting a bilingual dictionary from the approved list and putting it in their hands and allowing them to use it. Because if we allow them, if we hold off on this resource and they get it a week before the test or the day of the test, it's of no use to them. So Title III funds can be used for this. And again, I think they're really important supports. Obviously, the ACT is an important test for all of our students. And I want every opportunity available to English learners that's available to non-ELs. I think we're about the end of the assessments. Are there questions about any of the others or anything else that you might be wondering?
Are those dictionaries mainly Spanish-English, or can you have French-English?
Oh, there are, off the top of my head, I'm going to say there's 60 or 70 languages, if not more. Yeah.
Yes.
And actually, I think I put the link in there, but you could just Google, it's just ACT approved bilingual dictionaries.
Okay.
And it is important, you know, and really the ones that are on there are pretty widely available. I would not want to see a district buying something that wasn't from the approved list. There's no, and the word to word, they really don't have definitions and grammar and all of that. They're just a word to word dictionary, but it's a good support.
Okay.
We did the ACT yesterday here, the pre-ACT, and I was a supervisor for the 2 ESL classes that we test. About one class has 12 students and the other class has 18 students, and I saw all the accommodations concerning the time that they, and so we follow those accommodations. They have more time than the regular student. I think that English and instead of 30 minutes, they have 45 and stuff like that. So in those 4 tests, they have more time.
Good.
And we use the dictionaries that we bought from the list that is approved. Yeah, we use some dictionaries that they are in Somali, since we have Somali students in this school.
Mhm.
And as you said, those are like plain dictionaries. They just have the translation word to word if it is a verb or something like that, but no any examples or stuff like that.
Right. Right. I'm so glad to hear that. It sounds like your school's doing everything right. It's a fair amount of work requesting those accommodations. They have to be approved on an individual student basis. And so someone in your school, whether it's a counselor, whoever's working on that ACT, has to either upload ELPA scores or something from your student information system showing that this student is identified as an English learner. But I'm sure you saw for yourself, I bet your students used all of their time too.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a long day even as a proctor. That's a rigorous test.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, I always enjoy talking to your students, and I'm so glad that you reached out to me. Please share my contact information, and I'm happy to remain available if I can be of any help or you have any questions now or the future.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? I did want to add just at the end of this, any other, I know we mainly been talking obviously about assessment. Are there other resources at the state for English as second language? Now, I know we have personnel, but I'm thinking, I know a long time ago we had the migrant library a long time ago down in Hastings or something. I don't know whatever happened to that, but were there any other resources that I could?
Yeah, the one thing that's coming to my mind, and first of all, we do still have a really strong migrant program. The migrant director is Sue Henry, and I think she lives in Hastings, so I'm not sure if that physical library was in her home. The Launch Nebraska site was created to help the transition back to physical classes. But even before that, last spring, and I will send you the link. So last spring, our digital learning department created lists of online resources to support learners, and it's broken out by content area. There is a page for English learners. And what's nice about these is that these are all vetted, because I'm sure as teachers, you guys get bombarded with try this and this is free and blah, blah, blah. But we have to consider things like student privacy. We have to, anything on that list has been vetted and it does meet the requirements to protect student privacy. And so there are some resources for teachers. There's some resources for families engaged in at-home learning. I'll send you the link because I have to think for a minute about exactly where it is. But that Launch Nebraska site on the NDE site is also pretty good too. It's got lots and lots of considerations for bringing students back into school. So we try, you know, I think we're always open for feedback too. If there are resources or supports that you think would be helpful and you're not finding them, let us know.
Okay. All right.
All right. I need to jump to another meeting, so I need to go. But thank you so much. It was nice to meet you all, and good luck with the rest of the school year.
Thanks, Allyson.
Thank you.
And those of you in the night class tonight, I'll see you, and the rest of you, I'll see you at other times. So, okay. Thank you for all your questions, Gustavo and Katie, especially Machiko, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the probing. It's always good, you know. find out things. So I'm recording this. I'm going to share this. I'll stop the recording